Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Circular Economy webinar series. It is session 37. And this session is entitled The Progress on the Global Plastics Treaty, Outcomes and Insights from the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee process. My name is Anna Oposa, and I am the Marine Conservation and Circular Economy Specialist of the TA, promoting action on plastic pollution from source to sea in Asia and the Pacific of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department. And I will be your host and your moderator for today. So as the title of the webinar says, we will be learning more about the INC process and the outcomes. There have been 5 Intergovernmental Negotiating Committees, or INCs, and the last one was in Busan a few months ago. Don't worry, it was not at all like the movie Train to Busan, but we will learn about some issues that were contentious and then some that were less contentious, and then the next steps, and of course, what ADB can do to support its developing member countries. So our speaker for today may be a familiar face to a lot of you who have been following the INC and the Global Plastics Treaty. He is Rocky or Roger Guzman. He's an environmental lawyer and policy specialist with an extensive background in ocean issues. He has held positions in various nonprofits and international organizations where he led projects for marine conservation to plastic pollution to fisheries management and strengthening environmental rights. Rocky obtained his master's in environmental policy at Duke University and is the deputy director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. Rocky, over to you.
Hello. Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone who's joining us today. I'm very happy to be back in this webinar series to be talking about the Global Plastics Treaty. Before that, let me share my screen. Okay, here you go. So again, thank you again, Anna. Nice to be back for this session on the progress on the Global Plastics Treaty. I'll be happy to talk more on the quite interesting developments on the treaty negotiations that are happening right now. And I'll be sharing outcomes and insights from the INC, or the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee process, where ADB has been part and participating since 2022 in the starting from the second negotiating round until the last one in INC 5. So for this session, I'll be talking more on 2 things. The first one is on the updates on what happened in the state of negotiations, especially from the last INC round in Busan, overview, timeline, key issues that are being discussed, as well as potential ways forward, especially from my analysis on the ground in the negotiations. And in the second part, I'll be focusing more on areas and potential opportunities for support for ADB, especially for developing member countries. So again, you might have seen some of my presentations, but just to give everyone here a refresher on what's been happening in the plastics treaty negotiations, the negotiating process formally started really with the resolution from the UN Environment Assembly in 2022. This was entitled End Plastic Pollution Towards an International Legally Binding Instrument. So we call it an ILBI. That's what it's formally called. The mandate of this UNEA resolution is to deliver a finalized treaty for adoption in 2025. So this year already. Obviously, and evidently, there have been quite some challenges there. But where we're at now is that we have just concluded last December 2024 the 5th negotiating round in Busan, Republic of Korea. Now, this builds on the momentum created in the 4 previous negotiating rounds from 2022 to 2024 in Uruguay, in France, in Kenya, as well as in Canada. Now, again, as I've mentioned, the mandate was to deliver the treaty for adoption in 2025, and the original objective was to conclude supposedly the negotiations last December in INC 5. But countries were unable to reach a consensus, and that led to a decision to suspend the negotiations and reconvene as INC 5.2, or the second part of INC 5, that will be held in Geneva, Switzerland, this coming August 2025. So that's where we're at now. in the negotiations. Now, I'll focus on some key issues that are being discussed in the negotiations. There are a lot across different control measures as well as means of implementation, but I'll be focusing on two key issues that have been the recurring point of contention in the negotiations. The first one is on plastics and chemicals and regulation thereof, and the second one is on supply and sustainable production. Now, the first one is on plastic and chemicals. This entails having control measures or provisions that seek to regulate plastic products and across the plastic value chain, as well as the identification of chemicals of concern and having regulations for those. Now, proposals from different countries range from having country-led measures to restrict production, import, or export of plastic products, or it could be also global frameworks incorporating lists or annexes that would have regulations for specific types of plastics or chemicals of concern. Now, that's one thread that has been a consistent point of contention in the negotiations. The second one is on having a control measure or regulations on supply and sustainable production. And this includes potentially having a target to reduce the production and consumption of primary plastic polymers to attain a sustainable level. Now, evidently, some delegations and some countries have opposed this potential provision as they argue that it falls outside the INC process and it does not specifically deal with addressing plastic pollution. Now, for both these points of contention, both these issues, it boils down to the interpretation of what the life cycle of plastic is that is within the mandate of the INC, and whether production or upstream measures and regulation of these measures would fall within the scope to address plastic pollution. Now, aside from these two things, constructive discussions have been taken as well on key issues, very important as well, including more consensus on having provisions on waste management as well as downstream solutions, including recycling. And that will likely be a key part of the plastics treaty. Now, the debate continues on whether provisions would be more mandatory or voluntary, whether that they would have more binding provisions across countries. And the other debate is whether the scope would be global in application and enforcement would be in the global framework, or would it be more national uh, in scope in application, and whether it would be more tailor fit to the country needs and context. Although right now there is growing consensus and there is a lot of discussion of having national plans and national action or implementation plans as the cornerstone of the implementation of the eventual treaty later on. Now, let me go to some issues that have propped up in the last negotiating round in Busan, especially on the shared interests. Now, for the first time since we've been participating as well, countries have really shown their shared interests on key issues and presented their positions as a unified group. The first, uh, the first group, I would say, is more of the high ambition coalition countries. The high ambition coalition is composed of around 67 countries that seek to include production and more comprehensive upstream measures within the content, within the scope of the treaty. And this group is supported by the Pacific Small Island Developing States as well as developing countries, notably the African group. That called for a more comprehensive approach and necessarily includes production and upstream measures within the scope of the treaty. Now, the other side is the like-minded group, which is composed mostly of oil-producing countries that argue for a narrower focus on downstream waste management. And this necessarily excludes production and regulation, plastics, and chemicals of concern at the upstream level. Now, some key points there. Rwanda, on behalf of 85 countries, reaffirmed the need for a strong and binding treaty that would veer away from more voluntary measures to really implement what is needed and necessary to address the problem. And Mexico, on behalf of almost 100 countries, called for clear, legally binding obligations to phase out the most harmful plastic products and identification of chemicals of concern that have not been actually discussed as an annex right now. So that's where we are in state of play in the negotiations. Now, I'd like to draw some attention on the discussions on finance and implementation, of course, and that will be of interest to the ADB. So in the discussions on finance and implementation, there are two threads. The first one, which is primarily fostered by developed countries and argued by them, is that there should be a mechanism, but we could tap existing mechanisms that we have, specifically the Global Environment Facility. And countries would rely on voluntary contributions from all parties. And they would also highlight the use of innovative financing sources for this. Now, the other thread is being led by developing countries, and this entails the creation of a new, dedicated, or independent multilateral fund, or at least a hybrid fund, which would look at an existing fund but work towards a dedicated fund later on. Now, developed countries would contribute this, but they also need to get funding from private sources as well, as this would provide stable and predictable finance for implementation of the treaty later on. Now, the thinking is that the fund could provide financial resources, especially to developing countries on a grant or concessional basis, and it could also provide resources towards compliance and implementation of specific control measures that would be included and are being negotiated as part of the control measures in the treaty. Now, it would depend on which provisions would be included or pass muster, and the legally binding nature of these provisions later on. That's up for negotiation. Now, just some thoughts also on scaling up finance under the Global Plastics Treaty and the discussions being held right now. It's important to have this piece of the puzzle like resolved because it's vital for supporting key activities, particularly the means of implementation for the Plastics Treaty later on. This includes technical assistance, technology transfer under mutually agreed terms, capacity building, as well as infrastructure for waste management or any other control measure that would require infrastructure. Now, key in establishing a fund is that countries should commit to clear goals and incorporate both public sources as well as private funding sources, as it's evident that public sources of finance is not enough to address the scale of the magnitude of the problem of plastic pollution. Now, under discussion here and under this umbrella is the development and a scaling up of innovative financing models. This includes green bonds, blue bonds, more use of public-private partnerships, EPR or extended producer responsibility systems, which is a fiscal control measure to raise funds, as well as a potential plastic pollution fee for primary plastic polymer producers. Now, these could generate a sustainable and consistent revenue stream for the financing aspect. Another promising approach is the possibility of having outcomes-based financing, which ties financial investments to measurable outcomes. And this is being discussed, especially among large financial institutions right now, as one of the key promising approaches for implementation. Now, for the implementation of the treaty later on, it would require additional mobilization and redirection of finance towards emerging economies, developing countries where the needs are greatest, and specifically, it will have to integrate private sector participation. Now, there have been some precedent, especially on successful financing models, such as the Multilateral Fund for the Implementation Plan of the Montreal Protocol. So that could be seen as a model somehow for the implementation of the treaty later. Now, as to the next steps in the global plastics treaty negotiations, the state of play now is that we have a chair's text, which would reflect the current state of negotiations and is seen as the foundation for future deliberations, with the caveat that all elements here are still in brackets, meaning they are open for modification in the next negotiating round. Although there's growing consensus on certain issues such as waste management and just transition, but all of this will be up for discussion in the second part of INC5 in Geneva in 2025. So you can check that QR code to access the chair's text. Now, from now until August, we also have some opportunities for more political buy-in, for negotiations later on, and this includes having uh, to maintaining the momentum created through the intersessional events, including the COP for the Basel Convention for Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste, for instance, and the UN Ocean Conference that will be held in June, which could provide an opportunity for high-level and closed-door meetings to enhance political buy-in among countries. Now, I would also like to note that even though Geneva will be in August, if we don't conclude there, there might be a change in complexion in the treaty negotiations if it reaches the UNEA or the UN Environment Assembly meeting, the UNEA 7, that will be held in December 2025. And this could be occasion where countries could potentially change the mandate to a different procedure or modality to enhance the process, or it could even go the other way around, actually. It could also possibly change the mandate as well or limit the scope. So there's a lot of possibilities there if we don't conclude by this INC 5.2. So that's what might happen, but we are hopeful that many countries are hopeful that there would be substantial progress in INC 5.2 in Geneva. Now here, a lot of people have been asking me what happens if the deadlock among countries continue. So here I put in some potential ways forward towards the plastics treaty negotiations. Ideally, we would have a consensus among countries that would also be a good level of ambition for the plastics treaty. But if that doesn't happen, I have put here some other approaches and potential ways forward and what might happen. So the first one is a consensus approach. So this means that countries remain within the UN process, the UNEA process, but necessarily because of all the contentious issues, countries will have to scale back at the level of ambition. Now, here, countries would need to focus on areas of consensus and defer contentious issues, particularly on plastic production, for instance, and chemicals of concern for future negotiations. So this provides the groundwork for a future, more comprehensive approach later on. Examples of this approach include the UNFCCC, CBD, all these which are quite seen as having lower common denominators, such. And then the second one, which also has precedent, is to have potentially a opt-out process from the UNEA process. So this means that countries or high ambition countries, for instance, can initiate a new process outside the UN treaty process. And they could start the negotiations and adoption of the treaty, of a higher ambition treaty, and it will be open for other states to join later on. Now, in this process, they can create de facto norms and include provisions relating to non-parties and encourage them to join the treaty in a future stage. An example of this as precedents include the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, as well as the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, or CITES. Now, the last one, another option, would be having differential treatment among countries. So this could entail having or adjusting the treaty structure to accommodate different views across different countries. Now, options here could be, for instance, allowing differentiated timelines for compliance, as well as opt-in or opt-out options for specific articles or annexes, whether that would apply to specific countries. Again, there has been precedent in some other international agreements on this. You can look at the Marpol Convention or the Prevention of Pollution from Ships and the Montreal Protocol. So this could also be an option that are being discussed later on. Now, I'd just like to really emphasize that for this, at this stage that we're at, that states can negotiate and determine the forum as they see fit and how they want to agree to a treaty. So whether it would be within the UN process, within the UNEA mandate, or through another intergovernmental forum, that's up to them, or between states themselves. But we have to see what might happen in INC 5.2 in Geneva because that will be a pivotal moment on what might be the next steps towards the achievement of this plastics treaty across the globe. Right. So I've given a lowdown of what's been happening in the state of play in the plastics treaty negotiations, and I'd like to focus now on where ADB has come in and where ADB has been quite active in the plastics treaty negotiations over the past few years. So ADB has been supporting developing member countries as well as cooperating with partners in key issues that's included within the scope of the discussions of the plastics treaty negotiations. But ADB really is looking at preparation for implementation of the treaty later on. So ADB would support in policy and investment, on three things: enabling conditions and policies to reduce marine litter and marine plastic pollution, uh, ha- uh, having or supporting investments in plastic pollution reduction, as well as, of course, knowledge, regional cooperation, and financing for solutions. Now, the ADB has been supporting these initiatives through the technical assistance promoting action on plastic pollution from source to sea that seeks to reduce marine plastic pollution and restore river and ocean health across different countries, primarily in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, through this TA, the ADB is supporting enabling conditions, including having data metrics and measurements and baselines as the basis for policies, and supporting governments at both the national level and local government level for policy support and development. ADB is also active in promoting the digitalization of the plastics value chain and perhaps also as part of the monitoring of the plastics treaty later on. This could be the option. And of course, investment support and catalytic financing for financing of waste management infrastructure, as well as various needs. Of course, all of this would be supported and aligned with the Global Plastics Treaty later on, especially at the national level, once national action plans are in place to implement the Plastics Treaty. Now, some opportunities for ADB support. First, it should be aligned with the Plastics Treaty means of implementation, and this includes financing provisions, technical assistance, capacity building, and technology transfer provisions that are being discussed in the negotiations. So just here, I'd like to give like uh, an overview of what might ADB support. This includes the implementation of the control measures, for instance, including supporting the infrastructure, waste management, MRFs, recycling facilities to ensure country obligations are fulfilled within the treaty. And then the second, importantly, is on supporting enabling frameworks. And this includes amending or actually creating new legislation or regulation, financing schemes, and monitoring systems across different policy areas. And the third is on supporting innovation in high-level technology. This would necessarily be aligned or should be aligned with the technology transfer provisions of the Plastics Treaty and could include innovation, supporting innovation, alternatives, deposit return systems in the digital scale. And third, and the fourth is technical assistance and capacity building, which ADB has been doing, including exchange of best practices and knowledge across jurisdiction and assisting the private sector to align their investments to the provisions of the plastics treaty later on. And lastly, of course, supporting regional cooperation through events like this, knowledge sharing, and enhancing and promoting partnerships. Now, the planning and programming across different countries, especially developing member countries in Asia and the Pacific, could look at specific issues. First, on the enabling conditions, this would their communication to develop national plans and support countries in doing that, national action plans or national implementation plans, monitoring and reporting, as well as EPR or extended producer responsibility systems. Second would be promoting innovative finance mechanisms. So this might include, again, PPP, plastic credits, EPR, again, as a source of finance. All this could be developed within national jurisdictions with the support of ADB. And the third one could be looking at developing digital roadmaps and solutions to ensure that there are options and there are a technology available that would enhance the management of the plastics value chain and reduce waste in the process. So these are all some plans and programs that might be available and could be supported by the ADB for implementation later on. Now, just quickly, I'd like to draw attention to what's been happening in one key country where we have been supporting in terms of plastic waste management with the TA as well as the other operational departments of ADB, and that is in Indonesia. So for here, it's very relevant for the plastics treaty implementation because Indonesia has we have a plastic policy-based lending program that is in place in Indonesia that was approved in May 2024, and ADB is investing $500 million in this PBL or policy-based loan, along with partners, French Development Agency, and the German Development Bank. Now, the goal is to support the government of Indonesia in developing and implementing policies and reforms, institutional reforms in plastic waste management that would achieve the goal of the National Action Plan on Marine Debris 2017 to 2025. The goal there is a 70% reduction on plastic waste leakage by 2025, and this action plan is the foundation of the PBL. So there are a number of interventions here, including which ADB is supporting, including improvement of plastic waste management by policy implementation and strengthening of institutions, consumption, problematic plastic production and consumption reduction, specifically through policy development, including EPR, waste reduction by producers, potential bans or restrictions, minimum recycled content, among others. So these are potential options, as well as data and monitoring tools strengthening for policy making, including having waste information systems in place. Now, that PBL is a core part and will be quite important really for the implementation of plastics treaty later on, especially at the national level, once they are required and obliged to have national action and implementation plans to implement the provisions of the treaty. But the ADB is supporting a system-wide approach, not just on the policy aspect, but also across different measures, including at the local level, where ADB is supporting local governments and city-level action planning through city-level action plans and digital roadmaps. We have had one in Cirebon City in Indonesia for plastic waste leakage reduction. Now, this intervention is further complemented by ADB investments in infrastructure and not just on the downstream management of plastic waste, but also on the upstream level, including piloting reusable packaging and refilling solutions, in addition to expanding recycling facility and capacity. So this is the entirety, the whole systems package that ADB could offer for the implementation of the treaty and to reduce plastic waste and plastic pollution across countries. Again, there are also the focus on digitalization and having support for roadmaps towards digitalizing the plastics value chain and supporting technology to enhance monitoring and compliance within the plastics treaty. Now, this whole package in Indonesia is seen as a comprehensive package that could be replicated in other jurisdictions. So potentially in the Philippines, this could also be there's also discussions on having a potential policy program in the Philippines that would support the National Plan of Action for the prevention, reduction, and management of marine litter. And that would be the foundation of a policy-based lending modality to achieve the goal of the Philippines for zero waste in Philippine waters by 2040. That's in the National Plan of Action. Now, again, this would build on a comprehensive package that would build a proper programmatic approach considering the legal framework, especially that the Philippines has an extended producer responsibility law in place, and it's up for implementation, as well as initiatives for various legislation, including legislation on single-use plastics. And it also looks at provision of support to local government units. Now, again, this holistic model would be complemented by other interventions that could be supported by ADB, including support the local level. ADB has been supporting the Manila City, and they have finalized the Manila City Action Plan, a roadmap to circularity. Again, complemented also by private sector lending, including the Indorama Blue Loan to expand recycling capacity in the Philippines, as well as digital innovation. And a key initiative here is having a digital twin for the Pasig River that would provide a virtual model to tackle plastic pollution or waste management issues and could provide a virtual model to optimize plastic or waste removal strategies in Pasig River, for instance. Now, with those packages, or comprehensive packages in Indonesia and the Philippines that could be replicable, ADB is in a position to provide support for developing member countries, specifically in the identification, preparation, and implementation of both government actions through policies and private sector investments as well. Now, through the PBL modality or the policy-based lending modality, they could provide ADB to provide support for the development of enabling conditions. And for investments, ADB could look at investors in the private sector could look at the ADB Ocean Finance Framework and green and blue bonds framework for operational direction for these kinds of investments. So really, ADB stands ready to help and assist developing member countries for the treaty's implementation, and ADB can offer the necessary financial and policy support for DMCs to meet their obligations for the treaty later on. Now, I'd like to end here that ADB's role is really supporting financing and policy and investment and provide a holistic approach to enable a circular economy for plastics across developing member countries that would cover a wide range of interventions, policy level, enabling conditions, policy reform, both at the national level and at the local level, as well as investments, including in infrastructure. And specifically now, the focus is on digitalizing the plastics value chain and enhancing monitoring and treaty compliance in the process. Now, this comprehensive package of both sovereign and private sector investments would support a system-wide transition towards a circular economy and could provide a replicable model to other countries and sectors that would seek to implement the plastics treaty later on and address plastic pollution, as is the goal of the plastics treaty. So I will end there. And for more information, we have a page where you can look at all the resources for the plastics treaty. You can check this out in the QR code here. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much, Anna, and happy to answer any of your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Rocky. Always informative. And thank you for being our representative to give us the insight of what goes on during the negotiations. So we already have some really good questions in the chat. And if the audience has other burning questions, please type them in the chat and we will make sure to read them out loud. So there's one question here from Danning Lu. I hope I pronounced your name right. Which of the three pathways for GPT going forward is most fruitful? So you had a slide earlier that had the consensus, the UN process, opt-out, and differential treatment. So which one of those three is most fruitful for plastic reduction, and what is actually feasible from your point of view? The other question is, if high ambition countries opt out of the UN and start their process, will that likely generate effective actions for limiting plastic production? So we can start with the first question. Which one of the three pathways is most feasible, most fruitful for plastic reduction, and what is actually feasible?
Okay. Thanks for that question. So those are two questions on which of the pathways would be most feasible, actually. So really, everyone in the negotiations is looking at still having higher ambition, and that would be like the goal that we want to have, higher ambition within the UN process. But it looks likely and more likely that it would be the consensus approach, and that would be remaining in the UN system, but really looking at a starting point on having like these control measures that are more palatable and agreeable to across member countries. So this includes, waste management, just transition, more recycling, but would not include plastic production, as well as sustainable supply targets, for instance. So that might be, I think, the most feasible for now. It could lay the groundwork actually for a more comprehensive approach later on, depending on the ambition of those people of the countries. But that would seem to be likely and more feasible at this level. So it could start there, and then it could build on later once we have more information. And it could also be built on by decisions of COPs, the Conference of Parties later on, to provide more interventions or more details on how this could be implemented. So that I think is where it's going now. So on the second question on the high ambition countries, if they do opt out, um, that would actually be a key issue. It could likely result into fragmentation and limited participation, at least initially at this stage. So that would be the risk of this process. But again, the other side is that it could provide, it could develop de facto norms because a lot of, substantial number of countries would likely support this higher level ambition version. And it could create de facto norms within the international law, as well as it could provide, ways of dealing with non-parties, so including trade and import or export, and they would necessarily have to comply with the provisions or the standards set by these higher ambition countries. So that's where we can look at as well at as one of the issues that could be included in this approach for opt out and the opting out in the UN process.
Thank you so much. So to recap, the consensus option is probably the most feasible at this time. And I find that like international negotiations are always so tricky because you have to have the right number of parties for something to be effective. And if you don't have those numbers, then it's not going to have the impact that the convention desires, right? So that's actually a segue to the next question. I saw that there was a hand raised. I will call you in a bit. Let me just finish the other question because it ties in with the previous question. What is the future opportunities for the ratification of the treaty once it is adopted? Looking at another treaty such as BBNJ, which is Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Convention, which was pretty much anticipated. There was a long global campaign pushing for this. But despite many signatories, it did not attract much ratification from countries. Hence, it does not have legal effect. So does GPT have high likelihood of ending up like this?
It really depends. That's the risk of like across any international agreement, specifically so multilateral and environmental agreements such as the BBNJ. Though for BBNJ, for example, it's quite a slow burn, even though it's like been 2 years since it's been adopted. The countries and a lot of campaigners, civil society have been pushing for more ratifications. We're slowly getting there, and I foresee that this might be like the necessary, what might happen in the plastics treaty ratification as well. But it also depends on what the final package might look like, right? If it's like a version that will be agreeable to most countries at the outset, then it might be an easier ratification across different countries and create that critical mass that you mentioned, Anna, for all countries, for most countries to be included in this process. So it will really depend actually on what the package will be after the plastics treaty negotiations have concluded.
Yeah, so much of it is still unknown because we don't know what the final text is going to be. And in UN negotiations, every comma, every word, it matters. So that's why this is a long process. There was a hand raised by Amy Hampel. I don't know if you still want to ask your question.
Hello. Sorry. Let me try to turn on my camera. I cannot turn on my camera.
There, we see you.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, Rocky, for the presentation, and thanks, Anna, for remembering. I don't know if my question is too specific, but in February, we went to Fiji, and actually, we had a discussion with P.S. Michaels of the Environment Ministry. He is leading the Pacific Islanders government in terms of the negotiations. So he's the one who is the voice of the Pacific in the negotiations, and he was complaining about how difficult the negotiation. So this is first-hand information from someone who is actually there in the negotiations, and he was complaining about how difficult the negotiations are, and how bigger countries tend to actually dominate and use their power and influence to sway the negotiations towards their favor. So he wasn't going into the details about what the position or what the issues uh, are the Pacific countries are facing, because it was we were just discussing post meeting. But he said they're going to have another lengthy negotiation in place. I wonder if you have information on what uh, the issues are faced by our Pacific DMCs. This might be a little bit too specific, but in case you have some issues to face, what we know from so I'm from the Water and Urban Development sector group, and we are implementing solid waste management projects across the Pacific. What we know is there's an increasing acknowledgement of uh, the negative impact of plastics uh, on a regional scale, and the governments are now aware of it and are very conscious of it. So I wonder if you could share just a few insights. What is the position, or what are the issues faced by our Pacific DMCs in these negotiations? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Anna. Yeah, I would be happy to share some. So for the Pacific in particular, and the Pacific Group, the Pacific Bloc, they have been very active from the start and across all the negotiating rounds. And the narrative really is that they have the Pacific Island countries have suffered a disproportionate impacts. They are not, producers of plastic, but again, they are suffering the most because of plastic waste pollution and marine debris that reaches their shore. So that really is the call for the Pacific. And the Pacific small island developing states, Pacific Seeds as a bloc, and along with other seeds as well, have been pushing for the more comprehensive approach that would include production, plastic production targets and limits, regulations of plastics and across the value chain and chemicals of concern. So they have been really at the forefront at this level, supporting the high ambition countries as well as the African group. But I would say that within the negotiations itself, it's not just like the bigger countries that are quite challenging for a lot of like Pacific and developing countries, even across Asia and the Pacific, across Asia itself, even in Southeast Asia, not a lot of countries are actually supporting like more, binding approaches. They have been looking more like voluntary approaches and like limiting the scope to specific parts of the value chain. So that has been quite challenging, even in this part of the world, in the region. So I think for now, at least for the Pacific, the call for like having like legally binding provisions and a greater scope across the plastics value chain, they would have to work more with like the 80, the critical mass that has been cultivated in the last INC5. That's led by, Rwanda, Peru, a lot of African countries in pushing for this. So it might be quite difficult, especially at this stage, but there are a lot of opportunities at this intersessional period. For instance, have the Ocean Conference, for instance, and there could also be more discussions at the ministerial level at this stage to, convince other countries to push for like specific measures or discussions on what might be agreeable at this level. Still higher ambition, but not too low. So these are options that that could be discussed, and we'll look at the INC 5.2 how it goes. So it's a lot of unknowns, but there are also a lot of possibilities.
Okay, thanks,
Thank
Rocky.
Yeah, so a lot of unknowns, but also a lot of possibilities. I like how you framed that. Something an optimist or something that someone is hopeful would say. Okay, we have a question here from Mahesh Pradhan. Wonderful presentation and update as always. Wow. I am interested to learn a bit more about ADB's Ocean Finance Framework and the Blue and Green Bonds Framework. Is this something that can also be developed at the regional level, like COBC, or primarily focused on at the national level to help taking GPT forward?
Great. Thanks, Mahesh. Nice to see you from COBC, from UNEP COBC. So yes, the ADB Oceans Finance Framework is being promoted as the standard and providing assistance, operational guidance for investments in particular. So this will be quite relevant, Mahesh, in looking at like investments for like infrastructure, for instance, across different countries, and as well as how the private sector can be involved in in the blue economy space. And a particular thread for this is on plastics and waste management and circular economy. So that might be quite useful, especially at the national level on the investment side across COMC countries. So if you have, if my colleagues here have the link to the to the Ocean Finance Framework and the Blue Bonds Framework, we'll be happy to share that as well. Mahesh, thanks.
Yes, thank you. We have a question from Christine Chan. Thank you, Rocky, for an excellent presentation. Do you see the final text to include regulations on plastic credits, given the pros and cons associated with plastic pollution offsets? Great question. Plastic credits, it always comes up in topics, in talks about circular economy and GPT.
Right. Thanks, Christine. Really great question as well on the plastic credits. So at this stage, at the treaty text, from what I'm seeing, it's not likely to go to that level of granularity on specifying specific innovative finance mechanisms. Likely, it will look at more at the financing provisions at least will look mostly at the multilateral fund, and the contributions and all those things. But that's not to say that there would be no reference at all to innovative finance. There could be a provision in innovative finance, but the specifics there would not be included in the treaty text. So it's becoming more and more likely that these specific, standards and details on like PPP, EPR even, plastic credits, levies, a potential plastic polymer production fee would then be elaborated further in a COP decision at the COP level later on. So that could be something that could be explored. So right now in the text, not likely, but there are obviously a lot of opportunities. And in each of these INCs, each negotiation round, there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of support from financing institutions and organizations on these innovative finance mechanisms. So definitely there's a lot being discussed and already being started at this stage.
Okay, so plastic credits might be too specific to be put in the text, but it could fall under the Conference of Parties or the COPs. Okay, we don't have any questions in the chat, but I do have some questions that out of my curiosity. What is so international negotiations are always state driven, like governments are the ones leading the talks, the discussions, the decisions. But in this webinar, there are representatives from the private sector and civil society organizations, and it's clear what civil society organizations and private sector can do after once the treaty it's adopted. But right now in the negotiation process, what are ways that civil society organizations and the private sector can not put pressure, but like what can they do to support states to lead to adopting this GPT?
Great question. And really, Anna, that has been like the challenge for a lot of civil society from the start. For many of these negotiations, you've been to a number, Anna, we've been together, but for these, there's quite a limited opportunities even for civil society. As observers, they have limited space as well. That's not to say that there's no access, but there is quite some limits on how they could be accessed. But for this at this stage in the plastics treaty negotiations, I think CSOs have been great at convening, countries, different, representatives and like diplomats and like key negotiators in these, events, the side events as well as outside the treaty, the negotiation rounds itself, and convening all these negotiators on what might be, a point for discussion, an opportunity for discussion, a platform where they can discuss like what might be, you know, what are the pathways to achieve a more higher ambition, so to speak. So this is what the CSOs are doing. But of course, the CSOs will still continue what they do outside, campaigning and media. So that has always been, in every INC round, you can see a lot of coverage from CSOs, from indigenous peoples, from children's groups, and they have been great at actually raising the profile of the issues and the provisions that are being discussed in the negotiations. So that they will likely continue that, and that will be, the role of CSOs in this process as the watchdog of the whole negotiations. So
Yeah, that's great. I think civil society has always been in, whether it's climate or illegal wildlife trade or migratory species, they have been acting like watchdogs, and they keep a lot of other stakeholders accountable, and make sure that they really fall through the commitments of the parties, or of the states. Okay, so we know that Erin has placed the links to the Ocean Finance Framework and the Green and Blue Bond Framework in the chat. So if anyone else is interested to look at that, please click the links there. So we only have a few minutes left, and if there are no more questions, I want to end with a sort of, we would call it in the Philippines, like the beauty pageant question. For you, what is the right level of ambition? Because earlier you talked about having to scale ambition back, but then you also have to have a high enough ambition. So what is that right level of ambition to make an impact globally for plastic pollution?
a very hard question, very beauty pageant question, Anna. But really, for me, as a lawyer as well, I would really stick to the mandate of the INC, and that goes into the, UNEA resolution from 2 years back. You know, it's for me, like, it's evident that this whole life cycle of plastics would necessarily entail like a huge range of the broader plastics value chain, and that will include, a lot of other, the upstream, midstream, and downstream measures. And because of the severity and the magnitude of the plastics pollution problem, it, we have to look at the different like options, the different interventions at every stage of plastics value chain, even if it's not within the plastics 3D process, but necessarily it would be great if that would be included as a regulation. So to solve the plastic pollution problem, we can't thing and one segment of the plastics value chain. I know it's good that there's a lot of interventions on waste management, for instance, but we have to do a lot more on other parts and segments of the plastics value chain to really end plastic pollution, as is the goal of this plastics treaty negotiations. So yeah, Anna, what
Thank
do you
you so
think?
much. Fortunately, you had more than 30 seconds to answer that question.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the
yeah.
answer for the right level of ambition is to stay true to the mandate that was originally presented, which created this GPT, or the discussion for a GPT, and also to look at solutions across the value chain, both upstream and downstream. So thank you very much, Rocky. I think I can speak for the participants here that it was very informative, and we look forward to your updates after August in Geneva, when we've had the 5.2 session. So thank you,
Yes.
everyone. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Rocky. And please, we are going to be sending out post-event, like post-webinar evaluation. So please make sure that you answer that. It's going to pop up when you exit. And we look forward to your feedback, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Everyone, bye bye.